Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, August the 7th. We are continuing our look at 2 Kings. This week our lesson's entitled God Honors. God honors people who demonstrate God's priorities. Our larger scripture lesson this week is 2 Kings chapters 11 through 16. So it's a lot of scripture to get through. We focus on chapter 12 and the reign of King Joash in Judah. If you remember last week, we were looking at the happenings in the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, with the lepers. And at the end of last week's lesson, we took a quick look at chapters 9 and 10, where Jehu becomes the king in Israel. And when he became king in Israel, in the events leading up to that, he killed the previous king of Israel and the king of Judah, who was Ahaziah. And so now this week we move to the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, with the events that immediately followed the death of King Ahaziah of Judah. In chapter 11, we get the background for King Joash's time as king in Judah. It starts out when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead. She arose and destroyed all the royal heirs. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being murdered. And they hid him and his nurse in the bedroom from Athaliah so that he was not killed. And so he was hidden with her in the house of the Lord for 6 years, while Athaliah reigned over the land. So Athaliah is, most believe, a daughter of Ahab. Some think maybe she was a granddaughter, but the prevailing view is that she was a daughter of Ahab, perhaps daughter of Jezebel. She's got a lot of the same qualities that Jezebel had. And when King Ahaziah was killed, she saw an opportunity here and seized the throne. And of course, she's from Israel. She's a Baal worshiper, and she has brought Baal worship, and she's promoted Baal worship in Judah. And in that light, she has no interest in continuing David's dynasty there. So she tried to kill all the royal princes. But Joash was about a year old at the time, and so the priest at that time was Jehoiada. His wife was Jehosheba. She was actually Joash's aunt because she's Joram's daughter. She's Ahaziah's sister, and she's also the wife of the priest Jehoiada. So in the 6 years that Athaliah was in control of Judah, they hid Joash along with his nurse in the temple predominantly there. And so there's indications that as he grew older, he probably played in the playground there in the temple area with other children, but nobody recognized him as the heir to the throne. Just Jehoiada and Jehosheba and the nurse. They're the only three that know that he's there and still alive. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary, makes the point that Jehoiada and Jehoshaphat had the patience to wait for God's time. For faith and patience go together. The writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 6:12 says, "Then you will not become spiritually dull and indifferent. Instead, you will follow the example of those who are going to inherit God's promises because of their faith and endurance." Isaiah 28:16 says, "Whoever believes will not act hastily." So in God's providence, He watched over the child as well as these three people who knew who he was, because certainly if Queen Athaliah had known what they were doing, she would have had the child killed as well as them. And during this 6-year period, Jehoiada made plans. And so when Joash was 7 years old, he made the plan with the palace guard. He revealed to them who Joash was, and he enlisted their support and their aid in protecting him. And at an appointed time they proclaimed and announced Joash as the king. When Athaliah heard the cheering and all the hoopla that was going on with Joash's coronation as king, she was obviously very disturbed, and she cried, "Treason, treason." They arrested her and executed her. The last verse in chapter 11, last two verses, tell us, "All the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, for they had slain Athaliah with the sword in the king's house. And Joash was 7 years old when he became king." Some of your translations may spell his name Joash, Joash. Some may spell it Jehoash. Same person. I'm going to call him Joash because that's what I'm more familiar with there. So, that brings us into chapter 12. In the 7th year of Jehu, now Jehu's been king in Israel for 7 years, Joash became king, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba, and Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Now, obviously, get the picture here. Joash is 7 years old, so he's not really capable of making the decisions that are necessary to rule a nation. So the high priest, Jehoiada, is his tutor, his mentor, and Joash seems to be a willing student. And during all the years that Jehoiada instructed him, he was a good king. He was obedient to the Lord. There's kind of an ominous note there in verse 2 when it says Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada instructed him. So remember that as we get to the end of chapter 12 here. Verse 3, there's a very familiar refrain, "But the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places." Although God might be worshipped in the high places, this setting was associated with the Canaanite, the pagan worship that very easily led to spiritual compromise. And we'll see it again, that this will become a problem at the end of Joash's reign. So that brings us to verse 4 in chapter 12, and that's where our focal passage for today picks up. So let's read verses 4 through 8. "Joash said to the priests, all the money of the dedicated gifts that are brought into the house of the Lord, each man's census money, each man's assessment money, and all the money that man purposes in his heart to bring into the house of the Lord. Let the priests take it themselves, each from his constituency, and let them repair the damages of the temple wherever dilapidation is found. Now it was so by the 23rd year of King Joash that the priests had not repaired the damages of the temple. So King Joash called Jehoiada the priest and the other priests and said to them, "Why have you not repaired the damages of the temple? Now therefore do not take more money from your constituency, but deliver it for repairing the damages of the temple." And the priests agreed that they would neither receive more money from the people nor repair the damages of the temple. We're not told, and I couldn't find any indication anywhere of at what stage in his reign that Joash made this decision to take these offerings and repair the temple. Obviously, he's 7 years old when he assumes the throne, and it's 23 years later. The temple has not been repaired. But his plan here in verse 4 was to take revenue from three different sources. He talks about that the money of the dedicated gifts, the census money, and when a man in Israel in that time reached 20 years of age, at each census that was taken, they were required to pay a half shekel of tax. That was called a ransom. And those provisions were laid out by Moses back in Exodus chapter 30. And part of the stipulation in that half shekel tax is receive this money from the Israelites and use it for the care of the tabernacle. It will bring the Israelites to the Lord's attention, and it will purify your lives. So that was one source. Then the second was assessment money, also called personal vow, money from personal vows. The instructions for that are back in Leviticus 27 if you want to read those circumstances. And then the third source was these voluntary contributions, special offerings, like those that were given for the construction of the tabernacle when it was constructed. And so Joash's instructions at this point were, let the priests collect this money all over the land here and use it to repair the damages of the temple, wherever damages occurred. Now, you might ask the question, well, why had the temple fallen into a state of disrepair? Obviously, even the finest buildings require maintenance and repair, and the temple's now 150 years old or so. So it would be time for some maintenance. But the recent kings, including Queen Athaliah, had neglected the temple. And we've seen throughout, from the time of King Rehoboam, all through the history of Judah here, at various times, Judah's enemies have either taken the temple treasure or they've been bribed with riches from the temple. So, Joash had an interest, and again, we're not told what prompted his decision, his interest in repairing the temple. He lived there for 6 years as he was growing up in hiding there, so he would have been very familiar with it. I'm sure. So perhaps that played a role in that. Second Chronicles gives us a little more detail about some of this, and that's one of the things that's important to understand. In 2 Kings, we get more detail about the kings of Israel and some detail about the kings of Judah. But in Chronicles, we get more detail about the kings of Judah. So in 2 Chronicles 24, starting at verse 4, it says, "It happened after this that Joash set his heart on repairing the house of the Lord. And he gathered the priests and the Levites, said to them, Go out in the cities of Judah, gather from all Israel money to repair the house of your God from year to year, and see that you do it quickly." The Chronicles account says, however, the Levites did not do it quickly. And so the king called Jehoiada, the chief priest, said to him, "Why have you not required the Levites to bring in from Judah and from Jerusalem the collection, according to the commandment of Moses, the servant of the Lord, of the assembly of Israel, for the tabernacle of witness? For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken into the house of God and had presented all the dedicated things of the house of the Lord to the Baals." So here in the Chronicles account, we see that Athaliah had been responsible for some of this damage and disrepair. So when you combine that with what we see in verse 6, it was so by the 23rd year of King Joash that the priests had not repaired the damages of the temple. So they've been very slow here in carrying out the orders of Joash. And so in the 23rd year of his reign, at the age of 30, he decided to act on his own. We don't know what prompted him to act at this point. Reaching the age of 30 was a milestone for Israelite men. It was considered the age of full manhood. So at age 30, a man was assumed to be mature there. And so perhaps this allowed Joash to feel more secure and emboldened him to act. Another factor that's been mentioned is that it was in the 23rd year of King Joash that Jehu was killed in Israel, and Jehoahaz became king in Israel when his father Jehu died. So it's possible that those events that are happening in the northern kingdom caused a reaction here and a renewed commitment on his part to repair the temple. So verse 7 tells us that he called in Jehoiada, the priest, and cautiously rebuked the priest for not doing their job. And basically he told them, since you haven't done this, I'm going to take charge of this program, and you all can keep the money that's given in those offerings, because that was part of their the source of their livelihood and their ministry funds. And so perhaps they had been reluctant to give that up to repair the temple before. And so the priests agreed that this was a good idea. I guess basically they had been relieved from their duties of this building program, and they were happy to be out of the building business here. And they agreed they would neither receive more money from the people nor repair the damages of the temple. So that brings us to verse 9. So let's look at verses 9 through 12. Then Jehoiada the priest took a chest, bored a hole in its lid, and set it beside the altar on the right side as one comes into the house of the Lord. And the priests who kept the door put there all the money brought into the house of the Lord. So in the Chronicles account, it tells us at the king's command, they made a chest and set it outside at the gate of the house of the Lord. So Joash gave the instruction here, the command. Jehoiada, the chief priest, took the chest. He bored the hole in its lid here, and he set it in its place here. And in the Chronicles account, in 2 Chronicles 24:9, it tells us they made a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem to bring to the Lord the collection that Moses, the servant of God, had imposed on Israel in the wilderness. So they made an appeal to the people, and they invoked the name of Moses and the appeal that he had made to Israel back in the 25th chapter of Exodus. Starting in verse 1 there, it tells us that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel that they bring me an offering. From everyone who gives it willingly with his heart, you shall take my offering." And then down in verse 8, "And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them." So here now Joash is invoking that time and asking the people to bring contributions to repair the temple. Verse 10 says, "So it was, whenever they saw that there was much money in the chest, that the king's scribe and the high priest came up and put it in bags and counted the money that was found in the house of the Lord. And they gave the money, which had been apportioned, into the hands of those who did the work, who had the oversight of the house of the Lord. And they paid it out to the carpenters and builders who worked on the house of the Lord, and to masons and stone cutters, and for buying timber and hewn stone to repair the damage of the house of the Lord, and for all that was paid out to repair the temple." So, verse 10 tells us that the response was tremendous. 2 Chronicles 24:10, "All the leaders and all the people rejoiced, brought their contributions, and put them into the chest until all had given." And so, very quickly, there was ample money to begin the work, and the workers were commissioned. As we read on in the 2 Chronicles account, chapter 24, verse 11 there. "So it was at the time when the chest was brought to the king's official by the hand of the Levites, and when they saw that there was much money, the king's scribe and the high priest's officer came and emptied the chest and took it and returned it to its place. Thus they did day by day and gathered money in abundance." And so they began the work. Verses 13 through 16. "However, there were not made for the house of the Lord basins of silver, trimmers, sprinkling bowls, trumpets, any articles of gold or articles of silver from the money brought into the house of the Lord. But they gave that to the workmen, and they repaired the house of the Lord with it. Moreover, they did not require an account from the men into whose hand they delivered the money to be paid to workmen, for they dealt faithfully. And the money from the trespass offerings and the money from the sin offerings was not brought into the house of the Lord. It belonged to the priests." Verse 13 emphasizes that the money initially was not used for some of the vessels and things like that. The question would be, why emphasize what the money was not spent on? And it seems that the idea here is that the essential repairs had to be completed first. And then, if there was sufficient money, then these ornamental or ritual objects could be produced or refurbished. And indeed, the account in 2 Chronicles 24 tells us when they had finished, they brought the rest of the money before the king, and Jehoiada, and they made from it articles for the house of the Lord, articles for serving and offering, spoons and vessels of gold and silver. And they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord continually, all the days of Jehoiada. So initially, they didn't do these kind of things, but they gave the money to the workmen and they repaired the house of the Lord with it. Again, 2 Chronicles 24 gives us a little more detail. Starting in verse 12, the king and Jehoiada gave it to those who did the work of the service of the house of the Lord, and the hired masons, and they hired masons and carpenters to repair the house of the Lord, and also those who worked in iron and bronze to restore the house of the Lord. So the workmen labored, and the work was completed by them. They restored the house of God to its original condition and reinforced it. Verse 15 tells us that the people they hired were so trustworthy that they didn't have to even give an accounting of the funds that they were using. It was so obvious that the work was going on and was being accomplished correctly and in appropriate timing. And verse 16 tells us then that the priests were taken care of as well. The money from the trespass offerings, the money from the sin offerings was not brought into the house of the Lord. It belonged to the priests. And going back to Leviticus, the sin offering, they were required to bring an appropriate offering to the priests. The trespass offering. Numbers 5:8 and 5:9 says, all the sacred offerings that the Israelites bring to a priest will belong to him, and each priest may keep the sacred donations that he receives. So, at this stage in Joash's reign, he completed the repairs to the temple. What can we learn from this passage of Scripture? There's a lot of detail there, and it's an interesting story. Warren Wiersbe in his commentary makes this point. Believers today know that the Lord doesn't live in church buildings or in any other kind of building. John 4:23 and 24, the time is coming, indeed it's here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Acts 7:48 through 50. Stephen's sermon. However, the Most High doesn't live in temples made by human hands. As the prophet says, heaven's my throne and the earth is my footstool. Could you build me a temple as good as that? Asked the Lord. Could you build me such a resting place? Don't my hands make both heaven and earth? And Acts 17:24, he is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he is Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples. And so we understand the truth of that. But, as Brother Wiersbe says, this doesn't mean that it's wrong to dedicate structures to his service and glory. The early churches didn't have their own buildings, but met in homes and in accessible public places, such as the temple in Jerusalem. It wasn't until the 4th century that the law permitted them to construct and meet in their own buildings. Some saints today oppose church buildings, say they're a waste of God's money, while others almost worship their buildings and get their priorities confused. G. Campbell Morgan clarifies the issue with this warning. He says, whereas the house of God today is no longer material but spiritual, the material is still a very real symbol of the spiritual. When the church of God in any place, in any locality, is careless about the material place of assembly, the place of its worship and its work, it's a sign and evidence that its life is at a low ebb. And so we see the truth of that here. They needed to repair the temple here. And to Joash's credit, he took care of that. I kind of wish that was the end of the story. It's the end of our lesson, but we need to look at what happened next. Back to 2 Chronicles 24, verse 15. Jehoiada grew old and was full of days, and he died. He was 130 years old when he died, and they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done good in Israel, both toward God and his house. Now, after the death of Jehoiada, the leaders of Judah came and bowed down to the king, and the king listened to them. Therefore they left the house of the Lord God of their fathers and served wooden images and idols. And wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem because of their trespass. God sent prophets to them to bring them back to the Lord, and they testified against them, but they would not listen. And then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, who stood above the people, and said to them, Thus says God, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord, so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he also has forsaken you. So they conspired against him, and at the command of the king they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but killed his son, and as he died he said, The Lord look on it and repay. So what a tragic aftermath of Jehoiada's death. And remember back in verse 2, it says, as long as Jehoiada gave advice to Joash, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Once Jehoiada is gone, things change dramatically. Back to 2 Kings chapter 12, verse 17. Hazael, king of Syria, went up and fought against Gath and took it. And then Hazael set his face to go up to Jerusalem. And Joash, king of Judah, took all the sacred things of Judah, took all the sacred things that his fathers, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and Ahaziah, kings of Judah, had dedicated, and his own sacred things, and all the gold found in the treasuries of the house of the Lord and in the king's house, and sent them to Hazael, king of Syria. And then Hazael went away from Jerusalem. The rest, it says, now the rest of the acts of Joash and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there it tells us, 2 Chronicles 24:23, it happened in the spring of the year that the army of Syria came up against him. And they came to Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed all the leaders of the people from among the people, and sent all their spoil to the king of Damascus. For the army of Syria came with a small company of men, but the Lord delivered a very great army into their hand, because they had forsaken the Lord God of their fathers. So they executed judgment against Joash. And when they had withdrawn from him, for they left him severely wounded, his own servants conspired against him because of the blood of the sons of Jehoiada the priest, and killed him on his bed, and so he died. And they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings. And then Amaziah, his son, reigned in his place. So what a tragic end for a king with such a promising beginning here. He had the son of his mentor and tutor killed. He worshipped idols. Here in this part of the passage, he gave the temple treasure and the money to the king of Syria there. He did all of those things after Jehoiada's death. And then Amaziah, his son, became king. And the final indignity for Joash, he didn't even get to be buried in the tomb of the kings. Be buried in Jerusalem, but not with the kings. Chapters 13 through 16 have a lot of information, and they cover a lot of kings. Very quickly, I want to point out a couple of things. As we start chapter 13, it tells us that when Jehu died, Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, became king over Israel. Then in the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz and grandson of Jehu, became king over Israel in Samaria and reigned 16 years. As is typical, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Down in verse 23, in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash and great-grandson of Jehu, king of Israel, became king in Samaria and reigned 41 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. And then in chapter 15, verse 8, in the 38th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam and the great-great-grandson of Jehu, reigned over Israel and Samaria for 6 months. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. The point I want to make out of those is that this was the fulfillment of the prophecy to Jehu. He was commissioned by God and anointed by God to destroy the house of Ahab and to the Baal worship in Israel. And verse 12 says, "This was the word of the Lord, which he spoke to Jehu, saying, Your sons shall sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation. And so it was." Zechariah, his great-great-grandson, is the 4th generation there. It goes on in these chapters and talks about 4 more kings of Israel, Shallum and Menahem, Pekahiah and Pekah here. So 8 different kings in Israel during this time. After the death of Joash, Amaziah, his son, was ruler. And then after his death, Uzziah, in the king's account, calls him Azariah most of the time. We're more familiar with the name Uzziah, and that's the name that we see in Chronicles. He reigned in Jerusalem for 52 years. The last part of his reign, he was a leper, and so his son Jotham was co-regent, and he reigned for 16 years. A lot of those 16 years, I think he was co-regent with his father Uzziah. And then finally, in 2 Kings 16, Ahaz he's the son of Jotham, and he became the king of Judah. What's significant there is that Amaziah and Uzziah and Jotham are good kings, godly kings. They tried to do what was right in the sight of the Lord. Ahaz is a very wicked king. And in these chapters, we begin to see the Assyrian kings, Shalmaneser, Tiglath-Pileser, crop up. And so as we continue our study, the Assyrians are going to become more and more a part of the picture and the dealings with Judah and Israel. Thank you. Come back next week and we'll pick up where we left off here after chapter 16. Thank you.